Greetings, all you Zoomies. This is BT's Fly Tying Friday. Tonight, we have Soft Hackles Made Easy featuring two great tires, Kathie Burns and John Kreft. Plus, we have a tip of the week that also will be focused in the soft hackle area. Hi, we're the Beatties from Boise, Idaho, as if you didn't know already. We're really excited to feature a couple of fly tires tonight. We have a Katherine Burns up first. She'll be tying a fly. Let me pull up the recipe and we'll just go over that real quick of the fly she's going to tie. She's going to be tying an orange partridge, standard 1X long hook. Thread will be orange. The rib is fine gold wire. Body, orange floss. The thorax is hare's mask or whatever you want to use. The partridge, the hackle is partridge. Thankfully, she lost one partridge and had a second. And the head today is going to be thread. Well, let me introduce Katherine Burns. Kathie is a good friend of ours from Shingletown, California, where she is just now dipping her toe into the Zoom fly tying demonstration waters. She grew up in Colorado bait fishing with her father on the Frying Pan River. After a 40-year hiatus from the sport, she moved to Northern California, where she was introduced to fly fishing. Kathie started tying her own flies to learn one bug from the next, and along the way gained an unexpected appreciation for the art and discipline of fly tying. She claims she has met some of the nicest folks and made many cherished friends from her time on the water and at the Vice. Please join us in welcoming Kathie to her new adventure, zooming on the fly.
As you can see, I'm using some uni thread, 8.0. That says fire orange. I'm using just plain orange. Uni floss, also an orange. Using a wire. This is UTC, an ultra wire, and it's small. I also use a Danville periodically, and when I use the Danville, I go to fine. I find that those two are most comparable to each other. I know all of you are experienced tires, so you know where to. So when I take this skin is where I get the feathers that I'm going to be using tonight. It's right down here at the bottom. And oftentimes is what I do is I'll pull out one piece like this from the same area. So if I'm going to tie several flies in a row, I'll have feathers from the same part on the partridge skin, and I'll be more apt to have some uniformity within that hackle. I'm going to tie it in first tonight, and I'm going to start by wrapping an orange thread about two eye lengths back. I'm going to wrap it back forward and trim off the excess. Because this is a very sparse hackle, very wispy hackle, I take a fair amount of the fibers off so that I really only have a few. And it's what I found, and I don't tend to be particularly compulsive, but it's what I found is this one doesn't take more than about 18, maybe 18 to 20 barbules. So this is the underside, the top side, just to be sure that they're even with each other. And I'm going to tie this in right at the point there where I started my thread. Tie it in slightly at the side. Hopefully then it'll just roll right to the top, which it did. And make a couple good tight ties. Then I'm going to wrap, hackle pliers off. Just wrap back a little bit and go ahead and use some of that bulk where the thorax is going to go, and trim off the excess. Now I'm going to take the thread all the way back to just over the hook point. You're tying this fly in a very, very small size. At this point, some people like to tie their wire in right now along the side and wrap forward so that they don't add another layer of thread. But for today, I'm going to tie back up. Put this back a little. To right behind the tie-in point, and tie in a piece of this UTC ultra small gold wire. I like to tie my wire in at the bottom of the hook, and I think many people do. In fact, I probably learned that from somebody who's sitting in on this. And the reason I try to do that with all the flies that I tie is that way my orientation in terms of where my wraps start tends to be the same, and I can keep my wraps more consistent. So I'll start here on the side so that as I wrap this, oops, I'm catching that. So that as I wrap this, it will move to the underside of the hook and wrap it back. Just secure it here in my materials clip and back to the front. These don't have to be really touching wraps, but the smoother they are, the smoother it will be when you go to put on the floss. And that is another characteristic of this fly, is that it is that you really strive to have a nice smooth body on this. Now I'm going to tie in the floss. I leave a pretty long tag on this floss, and the reason is I have been known to get it tied in with just a little tag, and then when I go to wrap it, that tag slips out because it's a pretty slippery material. So I leave a pretty good tag on it so that I have some wiggle room if it does slip on me. I'm going to tie it down there with a couple good tight wraps. I think that this is an important step in this fly, and that is to take your time with the wrapping of the floss. That's so that you can get nice, smooth touching turns, and you'll end up with a nice, smooth body. For me, I find that floss can ravel a bit, just like when you're using silk. So when I tie normally, when I don't have a camera, I tend to handle it out quite a ways for the full length almost that I'm going to use. But with a camera, I don't have the room to do that. The reason I like to handle it out is so that I'm not constantly doing this with it, pulling up and down and causing it to fray. This fly, as many flies back in when this one was first documented back in the 1800s, were traditionally tied with silk. The other evening when we were tying on at the FFI Women's Connect group, one of the ladies did tie it with a Purcell's gossamer silk, and it was a beautiful fly. Oops, I don't like that because I got a little bump there. I want to come back over that final turn and be sure that I make touching turns from then forward so that I have a nice smooth body. There are people who, again, like silk, especially, I've only, my main experience, although I've tied a few salmon flies, my main experience with silk is in wrapping some rod when I've been building a rod and wrapping it, and use a burnishing tool. And there are people who do burnish this a bit to try to make it very, very smooth. But I found whenever I try to do that, even with something very smooth, I find that I end up fraying it, and it's just almost not worth it. I end up with a smoother body if I just leave it. I'm going to tie that off with 3. I'm going to cut off the tags here on my floss. I mentioned the other night that I'm one of those people who's rather infamous for cutting her thread. So I generally turn it to be sure that whatever I'm cutting off is at an opposite side. So I'll get those separate of where my thread is so that I don't cut those off. Now we're going to wrap our thread forward. I'm going to wrap it reverse. Generally, 3 to 4 wraps is enough for this tie when you're tying it with a, like a 16 or an 18. I find that it takes about 5 if I'm tying it like I am tonight on a bigger hook or even on a 10 or a 12. So there's 1, 2, go, tie off the wire. This is pretty fine wire, so I'm just going to helicopter it off instead of cutting it off. And now I'm going to put some dubbing on here. As you can see, in this case, I'm using a tan BT's dubbing. I saw it recently, somebody tied it with a black thorax, and that's not what it calls for in the traditional recipes, but it was very, kind of very striking to see. With a little bit of variation in. And again, with dubbing always, it's easy to overdo it. So always about a third of what I think I'm going to need. I'm going to just wrap that around for a, again, I'm running into my camera here. I need to shorten that thread. This can be rather softly tied, and it can be a bit on the buggy side, but it still needs to be strong enough to back that hackle up too. I've got a little more than I'd like, so I'm going to take a pinch off there. Bring my thread over in front of my hackle. So before I even start, I'm going to brush it back. Bring it around, keeping it brushed back, bring it around once. And I think that's all I want. That looks good and sparse to me. So I'm going to go ahead, brush it back again. I'm going to tie it off here, trim off the excess. Keep brushing it back. As I do so, begin to build a head, and the head is just a thread head only, just a little thicker up here toward the hackle and working your way down. But finish that. Yeah, well, and I'm not experienced at this yet, with it only being time 2, so I'm going to put just 3 whip finishes on there, pull it off. Trim my thread. So that's the soft hackle. Again, looking for sparse hackle, looking for like evenly hackled all the way around. And you can certainly put head cement on this if you wish. That's optional. I did the other night. I chose not to tonight, but so there it is from the front. It could even be a little flimsier even from both sides and from the underside.
Good job, Kathie. Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Kathie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be spotlighting John Kreft in just a little bit. Let me go through the recipe for his fly. It's the River Keeper Soft Hackle Cripple. Again, it's just a 1/8 long dry fly kind of a hook. You pick the size, thread to match the body color. The body will be super fine dubbing to match the natural. Thorax is Zelon, color as close to the natural as you can get it. The hackle will be mallard covert feather, and the head will be thread. Let me read an introduction. This is John Kreft from Sisters, Oregon, who pursues his retirement, tying flies, and many fishing adventures he enjoys with his wife, Karen, demonstrating fly tying at fly fishing expos and his 50+ years at the Vice prompted him to enter the digital world in 2014 with a weekly blog, Riverkeeper Flies, detailing his fishing, tying, and travel adventures. Be sure to visit www.johnkreft.com to find over 200 pattern sheets and information on the numerous Western waters he and Karen have visited. If you are not regular members of his blog, sign up. They come twice a week and we look forward to them every single week. You'll be glad you did. Remember, the website is www.johnkreft.com. And John, take it away.
So that's if you sign on to Riverkeeper Flies, this is what you see each week. And on the left-hand side is the newest blog post. And as Al said, I've been doing this for a few years, and he's the one that I really credit for my photography skills, that he pushed me to improve after I started the whole thing. So this is the fly we're going to tie tonight. And as Kathie demonstrated her fly, the proportions are going to be very, very similar. But if you look at her fly versus mine, mine is grossly over hackled. And there's a reason for that. So this is an image of some mayflies that I took in an eddy. And if you notice those wings, they're all laying flat in the water. And my home waters here in Central Oregon are the Metolius River. And I would never suggest coming to fish the Metolius River because, as I've said many times, there's no fish in it. And I want everybody to know that. But sometimes you might be lucky. And what I found is that cripples and emergers seem to work a lot better for my catching. My wife Karen and I fly fish a lot. That's about all we do. We take fly fishing road trips in our camper van now. We were gone for 45 days on our first trip to Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming this year. But we just are lucky to be able to get out on the water. And so most of the time we're dry fly fishing. And looking at this image is really what this fly is all about. So I was lucky to capture an image of a mayfly that just happened to be on my hook. And this really demonstrates the profile that I'm trying to tie with this fly. And this fly was really developed by my wife. The story goes something like this. She was catching fish and I wasn't, which is not uncommon. And she's sitting over here in the corner listening to this, and she says, "Oh, how many times have I heard this story?" But I said, "What are you using?" She said, "Well, one of your soft hackle dries." And I said, "I don't tie. What are you doing?" She said, "Well, I'm using this." It ended up being a fly very similar to what Kathie tied tonight. And she said, "But it doesn't float very well." And I said, "It's not designed to float. What are you using?" So she was using something called frog spanny, which I'll show you in a little while. And it's a desiccant. And she was coating the fly in the wings, and it was sitting on top of the water. And I go, well, being a fly tyer, I can probably help with that. So I selected a lighter wire hook. And in those days, I was just using Hungarian partridge, and some of the skins are a brown cast to them, and some of them are a light dun cast to them. And so I was trying to find the right materials for them. For the mayflies, the PMDs I was trying to imitate, I wanted a lighter color wing. And so I was using the lighter color, but the structure of the feather is such that it really wouldn't float too well. It would float for a while and then it would start to sink. So then I started using any upland game bird I could find in a small feather. And I use quail, I use just a variety. I use grouse, I use jackadaw, I use anything I could find. Until I finally found a quill from the covert feathers. But I want to show you in the corner of the mouth. This is a fish that I caught today about 1:30 this afternoon. And there were fish rising on the Metolius, even though I told you there's no fish there. And I said to myself, they wouldn't take a fly. And I said, well, I need to tie on one of my soft tackle cripples since that's what I'm tying tonight. I wonder if it'll work. And this fish took it. This happens to be an imitation of a blue wing olive. And the fish was about 14 inches. I just quickly took my camera, snapped a picture, and came home and added it to my little PowerPoint. So this is just to prove the point that they do work. So this is a Mallard Wing, and the covert feathers are where my bobbin holder is pointing. And it turns out that mallards float. Hungarian partridge don't so much. And so that's why I'm using the covert feather from a duck. That the structure, and I'll show you the feather, but that's the reasoning behind going to use a mallard, or actually a duck. I use different ducks as well. But the trick is trying to find the right size hackle for these. So let me get back to the camera. And if you have any questions as I'm going through this, please ask them. And Al, if you would maybe just read the questions, because I won't be spending a lot of time looking at the screen when I'm tying. But this is
thanks.
Yeah. And I'm doing my materials a little bit different, so I'm just going to hold them up for you. So the hook I'm using is an Alec Jackson soft tackle hook. It's a size 11, but any dry fly hook will work for you. And the size 11 is comparable to a size 14 dry fly. Why? I don't have any idea. The whole idea of having some standard for hook sizes escapes me why they don't do that, but they don't. And I think I need to change my glasses. So I'll be using some uni thread, a light Cahill. Again, it's just I'm going to be tying a PMD version of this. And I've used, I use uni thread for the small ones, and I'm using Danville as well for some of my bigger flies. But I just start behind the eye, and I just make touching turns about halfway down. For my dubbing, I'm just using Superfine. It's just a pale yellow. And I'm just using a wisp. I use very little. I'm putting it on clockwise. Use just a little bit more. And I've used a very skinny noodle on my thread. And you notice that when I came back, I stopped about halfway down the shank of the hook. And what I've learned over the many years I've tied flies is that for a lot of years, I had quite a bit of bulk on the back end of the fly. And that was because I would take my thread all the way back here. Then I would apply my dubbing, and then continue to wrap a few bare thread wraps, and it would just start building up bulk on the tail of the fly. And I didn't want that. So what I've learned to do is leave a little bit of room, apply the dubbing when I'm halfway down, and continue to go back. And there's about the first wrap. And much like Kathie mentioned, I'm not going all the way back. And then I'm just creating a little bit of a taper. Flattening my thread. What I decided to use, I'm using some crinkled Z-Lon and some material. If you've not used it, it's got a little bit of sparkle to it. And I use the color that's the same color as the wing. And I think that it does, I use it for two reasons, and who knows if it's true or not, but I think it adds a little bit of sparkle. And then secondly, it provides some structure to hold the wing up. And I'm just twisting this. I'll cut the fibers so that they're flat. I'll make a couple of soft thread wraps and then pull the materials back. And I usually don't have to trim a couple of fibers there, but not too bad. And I'm going to trim this now about half the body length. And I'm not going to pull tight, because if I do that and trim it, then it bounces back. So just keep it a little bit loose. And now for the feather, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just taking feather off of the leading edge of the wing, and these are covert feathers. And you just pluck them out. Here's a large one. And much like Kathie did, I'll start stripping the fibers on either side. And then take my hackle pliers and fold them back. So this is a perfect feather that I would use for a green drake. And this is a green drake that I would use. So you notice the proportion. And in a green drake, I do have a ribbing to it, but most of the others I don't use a ribbing. So on a feather for the PMD, then I would use this size. Maybe that's a little bit larger, and then I've gone ahead and prepped one. So I pulled it back, pulled the fibers back. And I'm going to tie it in by the tip, but the first thing I'm going to do is trim this. Now, you don't have to, but I have found that if I attach this and then go back and trim it, I have more of a chance of trimming feathers that I don't want. And I've had more problems than not. So make a soft wrap. and then secure it tightly. And there's 5 wraps that I use for that. Now, if you start tying these, we'll see if it happens to be me tonight, but sometimes as you pull it, the feather has a tendency to pull out. And so that's why I make those strong wraps. Sometimes if you're using a waxless thread, you might want to wax your thread real quick. So I'm gonna hold on to my hackle with the hackle pliers. I moisten my fingers and I'm gonna take it and pull the fibers backwards. I'm gonna release the pressure on my hackle, just let it fold down. If I hold it up tight and squeeze, it has a tendency to pull out. So release the pressure, a little bit tension and squeeze, and you notice how those hackles are now folding back. The first wrap is the most critical. If you're going to break the feather, it will happen then. And I'll just continue to fold those around, touching turns, going forward. Sometimes if you hold your breath, and that works pretty well. I've just got barely 1 thread wrap on. Tight wraps. Now I'll just make the head. Going back up into the feather, and that helps with the profile. Again, flatten my thread. And we'll do a 5-turn whip finish. Going forward, because that's what Al taught me. And then just touch your scissors to the thread, and you're done. So I tie these, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I tie these in a variety of colors and sizes. This is one to rival Kathie's tonight. So this is what I would tie for a March brown. And you notice how much more hackle is on it. So that's Hungarian partridge. And I'm trying to get that to float. Those wings are stuck in the meniscus, and it makes it easy prey for a trout.
So John, the reason you heavily hackle is just to get the float. Is that correct?
Yep, that's exactly right. I'm tying a dry fly. So most of the time when people hear a soft hackle, they think that you're going to swing the fly subsurface, and that's not our intent.
Okay.
Our intent is to have a dry fly, a dry mayfly that is floating in the surface.
Gotcha.
And so this is one of my green drakes. And this guy is probably a size 19 blue wing hackle that was sticking in the mouth of that fish you saw a little while ago.
All right. John, I do have a question from Ben.
Yeah.
Mallard floating property is interesting, but have you noticed the lack of barring / coloration is a detriment?
I have not seen the lack of barring as a detriment at all. If you saw the picture of the PMD, it is it's a similar color. So it doesn't have any bars in it at all. And many of the blue wings that I see don't have any barring either. If you look at the example that I had of my March brown, it does have that.
Sure.
And so I think that that emulates the wing. The structure of the feather is such, let me pull this larger feather out. If you were to take any upland game bird, a grouse, a quail, and just poke these barbules, they would bend. But on the duck fibers that I use, they're much stiffer. And so I think that makes them float more. And further, if you see a duck floating on the water and they get up, the water repels pretty quickly from their fibers, or from their feathers. So that isn't what I had experienced with quail or even Hungarian partridge. The other thing I'll show you is sometimes I'll use, this is a green teal wing. And so for a green teal, they're darker than a mallard. They're harder to come by, so you have to have hunting friends. But their feathers are also a lot smaller. And I've tied these down to size 22s. They're not the easiest to tie, but you can do it. But I will use that. And then for back to my mallard wing, right on the leading edge is where you'll find the smallest fibers. And then coming back up in this area, you'll find larger ones. And I can actually get a few size 8s, but this particular feather I'm pulling out, the stem is pretty stiff, and it probably you wouldn't be able to wrap it around a hook. Well, maybe. But as you get farther up the wing, the main stem gets much stiffer, and I can't use them for that. The other thing I would say is that I've purchased, I think the best mallard wings I've ever seen were from Blue Ribbon Flies. And this is one that actually has some brown mallard feathers along the side of it, which I've never seen that in some of the other manufacturers that you see. If you're looking for wings, make sure that you've got good material down here if you're selecting them. I purchased some wings on mail order, and when I got them, all of this was just gone, and it was really useless. The added plus is that you can use the primary feathers then as, was it Eric Austin? Was that his name?
Eric Austin, yes.
Yeah, he was using those for the upright mayflies that he was tying for the wings. So let me get the fly into the center here.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what it's doing is floating straight down with the hook up. And my wife taught me that you take this fly and you get it wet. Why? I don't know. She just told me that, and I do it because it works. And then I'll take frog's fanny.
Oh,
So what I'm going to do is take this frog's fanny. And the reason I like frog's fanny is because it has a brush.
okay, that's nicely focused, John.
So I'm going to take my brush, turn it around here. I'm off the screen for this moment. And what that brush does is separates some of the fibers. So then when I drop it on the water again, it just floats. And if you recall those images I had of those naturals, their wings are stuck in the surface. And so I think that it provides a nice profile of what the original is.
Absolutely. That looks wonderful, John.
Now, not to be outdone by the Beatties, I do have one little added tip. These are my hackle pliers. And what I've done, I've had problems with the barbules slipping out of it. And I might have read this from the Beatties, one of their tips. But I've just taken some electrical heat shrink that you just put on here, cut it, put it over a flame, and it makes this nice little tip that I've
Nice.
just used on one side, and it provides a little bit of holding power. I just replaced it last night because I'd used it so much.
That's an awesome tip, John. Everybody ought to want to take note of that.
Thank you, John. That was great.
That was awesome, John. Thank you. Kathie, thank you so much, both of you. Well, we're back to the time for a short tip before we go, and we have this fetish, if you haven't figured out, of brooms. Yeah, the last tip is going to be another broom. And in fact, I would like some help from all of you out there. By the way, I'm going to take one of these strands out of here. This is some type of synthetic stuff. If it's nylon, it doesn't act like any nylon we've ever used. The mud flap that we used several weeks ago, the push broom that we used last week, and this, they all have, the material acts the same. It does not act like nylon. So if any of you got an idea what this stuff could be, send me an email, give me an idea. I mean, we'll give you credit when we discover what it is. But anyway, it melts really nice. It's
A broom is really appropriate for Halloween.
no comment. Whatever I say, I'd be in trouble. Anyway, so our tip tonight is going to be, I'm going to actually make the eyes this time and put it on a fly. That right there is a number 16 fly that we're going to tie tonight. This is one I tied just strictly with fishing colors, gray body, peacock head. I am not going to use those colors tonight because we want to show you how the whole process comes about. Let me get rid of this and I'll put another hook in the vise. By the way, this is the first and probably the only time that I am going to tie with on Zoom with these smaller hooks. However, for my own fishing and tying, I really prefer tying small flies instead of those darn big ones that we do all the time for Zoom. Anyway, there's a size 16 hook, and I should be able to zoom in just one click there and be a little bit easier to see. But for right now, I'm just going to back up and bring out a piece of that material. And what I have found in digging around with, let's see, I got to find a pair of these, excuse me, tweezers that stay closed. They come to a real nice fine point. Anyway, and I'm going to use that to hold it to melt the material. Now, how much material do you use? Well, we found in our playing around is if you take it so that it's a piece that's equal to the length of the shank plus the hook eye, it's just about the right amount. And I'll just snip that off. And put that in the tweezers to hold it. Now, where do you put it in the tweezers? Well, you notice that tapers really fast to a fine point. Let me twist my hook around, tip it up so you can see the width of the hook eye is about how much space I want to leave between where my two eyes are going to be. That's just about how much space I'll need to construct this size 16. And we have them back in the same general area. I'll go ahead and start my flame. What I really like about the way this stuff melts is it just doesn't run and droop like the nylon does. Must be some kind of a polyester or something. All right. Now those are going to be hot and I'm not going to touch them, but I came prepared. Here's some I did earlier. Now what I'm going to do, I'll just set those aside. And for now, I'll grab my bobbin, thread, and I'm going to start my thread base back about 2 eye widths on the hook. I got to give myself some space in there to tie those eyes on. I'll wrap part way back on the shank and then back to my starting point. Now this fly is going to be constructed a little differently than the ones that you saw earlier tonight. Let me just, I got 2 feathers here. I only need 1. I'll take this one right here. And this is a size 16 hook, and I'm using a size 12 feather. And for those of you that don't know about sizing feathers, here's the tool that I use to size them. And what you do is you just take the feather and place it over the gauge and see where the fibers, okay, the fibers are too short to be a 10. And then you come back and up, they fall into that range of 12. So size 12 is what we're going to use. And where do you start using the feather? Too often fly tyers will start using the feather and where the stem is just too darn stiff. So I want you to take a really close look. In fact, I am going to zoom in here for this part of the demonstration. And I want you to notice that I've got a really heavy stem there. And it's really heavy up until I get to about this point here. And then it all of a sudden goes from very heavy to a lot less heavy, and then it goes on down from there. So I'm going to come right into this general area here and strip away the fibers. That'll give me a starting place on my feather. Now I'm going to back away to tie this feather on because we're going to do it a little different than what you've seen Soft Hackles done before. This is the way we do all of our own fishing flies, and we have a few customers that have us tie them for them, but not very many. This is a fishing fly that we're tying. Now, I really want it to be tied on top of the hook, and if I set it on top and start to wrap, I want you to notice that what happens really is it gets pushed down on the side of the hook. But I want it to be on the top, so I actually bring it down on my side of the hook so that thread torque will position it right there on top, because that's where I want it. And I'm just going to use that stem to provide a little bit of underbody, if you will, a little bit of bulk to the underbody. Gives me a little bit of taper. All right, now I get my hackle pliers. And these turns are going to be placed reverse of what you normally do turns of hackle. They're going to be wrapped from front with each subsequent turn behind the previous. And I'm going to do 3 turns for this illustration. However, if this was actually going to my fly box, it would be 2 turns or 1, depending on the feather and the size and all that stuff. And I'm going to tie this off on top, right on top. Now, let me just get rid of my hackle pliers. And I'm just going to pull this back and start wrapping towards the back of the hook to anchor the feather until I reach a position right at the hook point. Then I'm going to take and pull the feather forward and snap it off. And what's remaining is the tail. All right, there we go. Now I'll come back forward That looks pretty good. I'll get my dubbing out here. Don't want much wax, just enough to kind of hold it, because I'm actually just going to kind of pull and twist the dubbing. Okay, I'm running into a common problem here. Another little trick. This is just a free trick. Let me back up just a moment from what I'm doing right now. Whoops. There we go. This stuff is called Sort Quick. You get it at the office supply house. It's for
Counting your money.
dampening your fingers. And we live in the Rocky Mountain West here, and my hands dry out something terrible. So that'll make it a little bit easier to dub now. I've got a little bit of stickiness to my fingers, but I don't want to use dubbing wax to do that. But before I get too carried away here, it's been so darn long since I've tied a 16 on camera that I can't remember when the last time was. So I probably better be careful about how much dubbing. Now I want you to remember, let's reflect back for a minute. Last week, we talked about the importance of crisscross wraps. And you're going to find out another thing about crisscross wraps right now, because I'm going to just keep right on wrapping, going back forward and ribbing my fly at the same time. Now it's time to fold the hackle. We'll use a Dutch Bauman trick of folding the hackle with the thread. And that's starting to fold it back. He calls that thread folding. I didn't know what it was called. I've been doing it for years and years and years, but he's the one that introduced me to the terminology, folding it with the thread. All right. So I'm doing that now, like I normally do from this side. And now I'm going to pull the tweezers out. Okay. Just flip it over here so you can see that we've got the eyes in place. Now we're going to finish the fly by just putting a little bit of dubbing in there and wrapping a dubbed head, where I would normally do peacock, but you need to understand that peacock and black eyes and cameras, they just all blend together and you can't tell if there's anything there at all. Okay, we'll do a whip finish here real quick. Now, at some point in the future, we will go into this whole concept of tying flies backwards like we just did on a whole series of flies. But for now, we'll just leave that as a fishing fly that we're gonna go fishing with, and answer any questions if you have them. Anything from anybody else?
Do you usually whip finish behind the eye?
Oh, on that particular pattern, I do whip finish behind the eye, back of the head. It provides separation between the hackle and the head. Now, there are times when I don't, but for the biggest part, I crisscross it and do the finish behind on that particular pattern.